I am the brilliance you will never have. You should stay behind the scenes, where mediocrity does not bother the eyes of success. Isabella Duran's acidic whisper floated through the air-conditioned air of the Beverly Grand Hotel, cutting through the buzz of champagne and laughter like a shard of glass. Her eyes, cold emeralds, fixed on the hunched figure of the waitress, whose simple hands offered the crystal-clear water she would barely deign to drink. At 38, Isabella was the embodiment of the Latin dream remade in gold, the CEO of Luz Dorada Media, and she believed her success gave her the right to rewrite social rules with the tip of her stiletto heel. She didn't see people, she saw steps, and that particular step needed to be reminded of its inferiority. Flashes. The cameras, following her like devoted satellites, captured the splendor of her custom-made gown, a cloak of power that radiated polished arrogance. Isabella moved through the gala with the confidence of someone who knows every step and every note of the symphony of Los Angeles power, hailed as living proof that ambition has no boundaries. Her smile, trained to media perfection, was the iron mask that hid a soul obsessed with altitude, oblivious to the soil that supported her empire. The glory of the evening seemed to belong entirely to her, an unquestionable triumph over any shadow of doubt. She waved to executives from Hollywood and smiled at politicians, each gesture calibrated to reinforce her image as an unattainable leader. The queen of the empire she herself had built brick by brick of pure ambition. The charity event was the perfect showcase for her latest project, a bold move into the Spanish media market in the U.S. that would cement her as the dominant voice among wealthy Latinos. The feeling of invincibility was intoxicating, filling every cubic inch of the room with the perfumed haze of her success. As she walked away from the drinks table, Isabella's gaze met the simple woman's again. Amalia Torres. Brief moment of eye contact, where the executive's contempt clashed with the servant's dignified stillness, creating a silent tension that few noticed, but which the security camera discreetly captured. Isabella's contempt was nothing new to her subordinates, but there, on that stage of charity and pomp, it sounded like thunder in a sky of appearances. She turned her back on Amalia, convinced that the interaction was nothing more than an insignificant footnote in the story of her triumphant night, a reminder of the gulf between her and the rest of the world. The audience seemed to agree, returning to their cocktails and idle conversations, oblivious to the volcano that had just been poked. Isabella's excessive brilliance, however, blinded her to the imminent danger, to the fact that technology had transformed every corner into a stage and every observer into a ruthless judge. Isabella's nervous assistant tried to warn her about the presence of independent journalists with cell phones, but the CEO waved her off impatiently. "Control the light, dear. You dare not blind me." Isabella's brilliance was actually a thick, impenetrable armor of vanity, preventing her from seeing the cracks forming at the base of her pedestal. The height was dangerous. The altitude made the fall longer, and the thin air more conducive to vertigo. The humiliating comment, recorded in high definition, began its silent journey through the depths of the internet, a digital virus of scandal about to infect Isabella's impeccable reputation. What she considered a petty exercise of power, the internet would interpret as a rallying cry against decency, a direct insult to the roots of the entire Latino audience she claimed to represent and admire. Isabella, oblivious to the impending disaster, raised her glass in a toast, feeling the fullness of her achievement. She toasted her power, her beauty, her intelligence, and the conviction that she was the sole architect of her destiny, untouchable by the forces of common morality. Little did she know that the hostess of the event, whom she had just belittled, possessed a power that went beyond financial. The power of a story of overcoming adversity and genuine empathy. The glamour. The room's atmosphere enveloped her, drowning out the warning signals. The silence that followed her comment wasn't one of submission, but of shock, a deafening prelude to the storm that would gather online. Luxury was a gilded cage that isolated her from the brutal reality of the world, one where people work with their hands, not just with ambition. While Isabella enjoyed the rest of the evening, believing she had reaffirmed her superiority, Doña Amalia Torres, the woman she had just insulted, watched her from afar. Her gaze was one of sadness and determination, without rancor, but with the certainty that arrogance, when exacerbated, carries within itself the weight of its own punishment. The night ended for Isabella with a sense of accomplishment, of another rung on the steep ladder of fame. But for the rest of the world, the night had barely begun. The 15-second video was going viral, and the Queen was about to fall from her throne of diamonds and vanity. The video had no dramatic soundtrack or sophisticated editing, just Isabella's cold voice and the awkward silence that followed, but it was precisely this rawness that made it an emotional bomb. The CEO's look of contempt at the woman serving water was dissected in loops endless, turning the drinks table into a social court, and Isabella into the most hated defendant of the moment. The title of the video, in bold and capital letters on social media, was a libel. Latina executive humiliates Mexican philanthropist. Thousands of comments poured in every minute. Isabella's message was clear. You should stay behind the scenes. The internet responded, you should stay behind the scenes of history. What Isabella couldn't process, in her bubble of glamour and power, was the symbolic weight of that interaction in the context Mexican-American, where the struggle for dignity and recognition is an open wound. She, who claimed to be the voice of Latin American success, had attacked her own mirror, the image of the hard-working, resilient woman who builds empires from nothing. The irony was cruel, and the humiliation was twofold, for the servant and for an entire community. As Isabella was being driven by her driver back to her penthouse in Bel Air, the name of the woman she had scorned, Mrs. Amalia Torres, exploded across all news platforms. Amalia wasn't just an employee. She was the host of the charity event, the silent founder of a hotel chain that began as the dream of a former housekeeper in Mexico City, a woman who donated millions to social projects. The revelation transformed Isabella's contempt into an act of colossal blindness and stupidity. The CEO had not only humiliated a servant, she had insulted the nobility and history of overcoming that she pretended to embody, but which she actually detested in its purest, most unadorned form. Hashtag Onde está seu lugarisa became the #1 trending topic, a chorus of condemnation that echoed from Los Angeles to Ecatepec de Morelos. In the car, Isabella checked her phone with a satisfied smile, expecting to see praise for the evening. Instead, she found hundreds of hate messages and a photo of Amalia Torres, smiling dignifiedly in every headline. Amalia's smile, which had previously seemed harmless, now seemed victorious, and the ground beneath Isabella began to shake. The initial shock gave way to arrogant denial. It's envy, a misunderstanding. They're distorting the context. Her assistant, crying, tried to convey the scale of the crisis, the speed with which clients and partners were issuing statements of repudiation, but Isabella was deaf, trapped in the fortress of her own wounded pride. The reality, however, was undeniable. Isabella's shine was fading in real time. The woman who shines too brightly was now the woman who falls. The glamour of the party turned into ashes, the luxury of his apartment into a prison of vanity and belated regret. What Isabella didn't know was that Amalia, upon hearing the news of her humiliation, had felt not anger, but pity. Poor child, so full of herself that she can't see the beauty around her, she had told her associates, refusing to make a public statement of condemnation. Her silence was the heaviest condemnation. Isabella's power was based on projection and image, a fragile bubble that burst at the slightest touch of truth. Amalia's power, in contrast, was sustained by history, community, and non-negotiable dignity, a rock-solid foundation that CEOI never knew how to value it. The chapter ends with Isabella throwing her cell phone against the marble wall. The sound of the phone breaking is the sound of her career in pieces. She looks at herself in the mirror. "It's over, Isa. Everyone saw it," she whispers, echoing her assistant's voice. The Los Angeles dawn didn't bring Isabella sleep, but the crushing weight of digital ostracism. The sound of distant sirens and the deathly silence in her apartment formed the soundtrack to her downfall, a requiem of ambition. The messages didn't stop, but they weren't from fans anymore, or paparazzi, but rather former clients, partners, and even close friends, all terminating contracts and ties at a dizzying speed. Joaquin Santillan, the tech mogul who was its biggest backer, sent a dry and definitive email. "The golden light no longer reflects our values. The partnership is broken. The trust is broken." The domino effect was relentless. Isabella tried to formulate a response, a polite PR apology, a generic face-saving apology, but the words died in her throat. She realized the wound was too deep to be healed by a press release, and the social outrage was too great to be swept under the rug. The American and Latin American media, once her ally, transformed her into a national villain, the embodiment of an arrogant elite that had lost touch with its own roots. The irony of being destroyed by the very vehicle that built her, the media and the speed of information, was exquisite torture. What was once her stage was now her tomb. Sitting on the cold floor of her living room, hugging her knees, Isabella finally allowed the glimmer fell. Without makeup, without her designer armor, she saw herself for the first time as a frightened and empty woman, staring at the ruins of a life built on sand. Success no longer protected her. It was suffocating her. The memory of Amalia Torres's face came back to me, flashbacks. Not the face of a servant, but that of a mother, a businesswoman, a philanthropist, a woman who radiated a strength that was not of money, but of character. This force was what Isabella herself had rejected and now feared. Your assistant Elena, who had been loyal for 5 years, entered the apartment to collect his belongings. Tears streamed down his face, but loyalty had turned to disappointment. "You didn't make a mistake, Isa," Elena said in a choked voice. "You just showed who you always were, and it hurts because I admired you." Elena's rejection was the hardest blow, the loss of the only person who saw her up close. Isabella felt the weight of the silence, the real and cruel weight of silence, of complete ostracism. There was no applause, no flashes, just the echo of her own voice humiliating someone. The phone rang incessantly with calls from lawyers and crisis managers, but she no longer had the strength to answer. The final step in the downfall was the opinion editorial of the LA Times, written by an influential Latina journalist. The title was "The Tragedy of the Woman Who Attacked a Mirror." The article argued that Isabella, in her contempt, had attacked her own origins, her own history, and that the castle was crumbling from within. Reading the text, Isabella was forced to face the truth that had eluded her for years. Her ambition wasn't for the community, it was for herself, and to prove that the poverty of her youth was a distant and shameful memory. Her contempt for Amalia was, at its core, a contempt for her own history. The chapter ends with the morning sun illuminating the sumptuous apartment, revealing the dust and chaos that have settled in. Isabella takes her laptop who survived the fall and types the name that haunts her, Amalia Torres. The search for knowledge is the first hesitant sign of a soul beginning to feel shame and, perhaps, the need for redemption. The sound of notifications on customers' phones and the harsh voice of press releases were the death knells for Luz Dorada Media. It wasn't just an image crisis. It was a moral and financial collapse. Money, the only thing Isabella thought was her shield, began to evaporate at the same speed as the likes were transformed into haters. The loss of the contract with Fernanda Cortez, the telecommunications magnate, was the point of no return, a loss of millions that would make even the most solid of companies shake. Isabella tried the strategy of invisibility, but the world had branded her with fire. Every door she tried to open, every phone she tried to ring, was met with a sharp silence or a curt and final, "We're not interested." The empire she had built on the image of success and Latino representation disintegrated before her eyes, swept away by the tide of popular indignation. The weight of loneliness became her daily burden. Her party friends, her business contacts, her usual flatterers, they all disappeared. She realized her social circle was a reflection of her bank balance, and that the loyalty she inspired was nothing more than superficial interest. Loneliness at the top was a myth. Loneliness at the bottom was reality. In a desperate act, she called the only remaining father figure in her life, a longtime mentor in the business world. His voice, always warm, was now cold and distant. "Business, Isabella, is about people. You forgot that they're not robots you can program. You didn't make a mistake in marketing. You have erred in humanity." The harsh truth was a punch in the gut. Isabella spent hours researching the life of Amalia Torres, the former Mexico City housekeeper who learned to read and write by candlelight and built a hotel empire based on ethics and the dignified treatment of her employees. Amalia's story was the perfect antithesis of her own, where one built on pure ambition, the other built with dignity and community. Her search for Amalia led her to videos of social projects in Ecatepec de Morelos, one of Mexico's poorest communities. She saw Amalia, with her simple smile, distributing food and hugging the elderly. The image of her victim was a stab at her vanity. The philanthropist wasn't looking for flashes, sought genuine transformation. She tried to force a meeting with her company's board, but the board was already moving to remove her from power, citing irreparable damage to the brand and shareholders. Isabella, the founder, was being forced out of her own creation, a victim of her own arrogance. The power she thought was eternal was merely a revocable loan. The most humiliating moment was when she tried to buy a favorable article in a small newspaper. The editor, a dignified elderly gentleman, refused the money. "Money can't buy what you've lost, Mrs. Duran. It can't buy respect. The only currency that matters now is true." In her isolation, Isabella began to have nightmares about Amalia's gaze, a gaze that didn't judge her, but saw her. What she felt wasn't just fear of financial failure, but a new and profound pain, the shame of having attacked someone so fundamentally good. The chapter ends with Isabella sitting on the floor of her penthouse, surrounded by memories of a success gone by, accepting the inevitable truth. The castle had crumbled, and the fall was not the end, but the beginning of a new and painful journey. Pride had been replaced by icy fear, and fear, for the first time, gave way to self-criticism. Shame was a slow, corrosive poison, unlike anger or despair, forcing Isabella to face the reflection she had rejected for so long. She was obsessed with Amalia's story, building a puzzle of dignity and genuine success. The research revealed that Amalia Torres not only founded hotels, but also created a cooperative system that guarantees fair wages and profit sharing for her employees, many of whom are immigrants and former day laborers like herself. She was proof that success didn't have to destroy ethics. Isabella found photos of Amalia at her first job in Mexico City, bussing tables at a simple diner. And then, years later, at a meeting with mayors, always with the same unwavering humility and warm smile. The difference between the two was stark. Isabella built her image, Amalia built her life. What shocked her most was the absence of bitterness in Amalia's journey. The woman who had overcome poverty and prejudice didn't seek revenge, she sought elevation. Amalia was the Latin success Isabella pretended to be, a success rooted in empathy, not opulence. For the first time in years, Isabella cried, but not because of the loss of money or status. She wept for the loss of herself, for the distance she had created from her own modest origins, for the conscious choice to exchange value for price. That cry was the initial crack in her mask of CEO of iron. The humiliation in the hall, the hotel, had not just been a public slip. It had been a self-attack. a feedback brutality of the universe that forced her to see the nobility she had crushed in her relentless pursuit of power. She had attacked the mirror, and the reflected image was consuming her. Amalia's story, detailed in old articles, spoke of the weight of silence of the woman who works hard and is not seen, but who, when she speaks, moves mountains. The name of Amalia's former social project, Bridge of Light, echoed in his mind, a silent invitation to cross the bridge from arrogance to humility. Fear gave way to a dangerous curiosity. Isabella no longer wanted to simply understand Amalia. She needed to understand how someone could accomplish so much without the contempt she used as her driving force. The question was no longer, how do I save myself? But rather, what does she have that I don't? She began emptying her closet of expensive designer brands, feeling the weight and superficiality of each piece of clothing. The red-soled shoes that had once made her feel invincible now seemed like symbols of a prison of consumerism and vanity. Luxury no longer comforted her. It suffocated her. The laptop was always open in Amalia's photo. Isabella tried to decipher the silent message in that face, the mystery of a strength that needed no shouting or orders to be felt. The former CEO, now exiled in her own home, was a reluctant student of the woman she once scorned. The chapter ends with Isabella's cold determination. She didn't have a plan. But she was certain of one thing. She needed to get out of that penthouse, that gilded cage. Shame was a driving force that drove her toward the unknown, toward the only person who seemed to hold the key to her future. The knock on the door, unexpected and firm, broke Isabella's routine of isolation. It was Tomas Vega, the investigative reporter who had made his video go viral and written some of the most incisive articles about his downfall. Tomas, a man in his early 40s with a cynical but honest look, sat down uninvited. He wasn't there to condemn, but to make a proposal as absurd as it was brilliant. The media likes blood, Isabella, and you're bleeding. But I like stories of redemption, the rare ones. He stared at her directly, unblinking. Your press releases won't save you. Your lawyers won't save you. Want to prove you're sorry? Do something that goes beyond words. Live the life you despised. The proposal came like a shot. Go to Mexico. Find a job as a maid. No glamour, no name, no status. Clean, serve, live. We'll record it all for a documentary, Invisible Bridges. If it's fake, you'll sink for good. If it's real, maybe you'll be saved. Isabella, with her mind of CEO trained in risk analysis, she saw the plan as professional suicide. Exposing her humiliation, working with her own hands, and experiencing the poverty she had fled since childhood were the antithesis of everything she stood for. But the emotional part of her, wounded and desperate, saw it as the only escape from the prison of her own arrogance. The emptiness that consumed her was greater than the fear of humiliation. The name Amalia Torres seemed to whisper approval of that insane penance. You need a bridge, Isabella, not a wall. The only way to rebuild your reputation is to rebuild your soul, and the only way to connect with the public is to connect with the people you've offended. Tomas spoke with the deep voice of someone who seeks not fame, but the truth. Isabella asked about Amalia, and Tomas confirmed that the philanthropist was aware of the proposal. She's not directly involved, but she said, if she goes, let her go with an open heart. It's her life that's at stake, not mine. Amalia's detachment was the greatest pressure. The decision was made in a heavy silence. Isabella looked out at the panoramic view of Los Angeles, the city that had welcomed her and now spat her out. I accept, but if I go, I'll go for real. No escapes, no shortcuts. Tomas smiled, a rare smile of professional satisfaction. The script of your life has just been rewritten, Isabella. And this time the pen is in fate's hand, not yours. He gave her a simple address in Mexico City, a name, Helena Rios. The chapter ends with Isabella packing a small suitcase. She leaves behind jewelry, designer clothes, and everything glamour that had defined her. The only thing she takes with her is shame and fear, but also a tiny grain of hope that hard work and humility could be a path to redemption. The journey was about to begin. Mexico City greeted her with the vibrant chaos of its sounds and smells, a stark contrast to the organized sterility of Los Angeles. Isabella stepped off the plane with a backpack and modest clothing, looking like just another lost tourist. The address took her to a simple neighborhood, far from the luxuries of Polanco, and to the door of Helena Rios, coordinator of the NGO Bridge of Light. Helena, a warm woman with calloused hands and steady eyes, showed neither pity nor surprise. "Are you Isabel, the new helper? Welcome. The uniform is in the closet. The floor won't scrub itself." The shock was visceral. Helena's house was clean but simple, with no servants, no luxuries, just real life in its rawest form. The former CEO, accustomed to giving orders, was now being told how to fold towels and wash dishes without wasting water. The first day was physical and emotional torture. The tile floor seemed to stretch for miles. The smell of soap and disinfectant replaced the French perfume. Her hands, accustomed to manicures weekly, they became red, rough, and sore, a constant reminder of their new and humiliating reality. In the kitchen, the center of the house, Isabella had to learn how to prepare simple, traditional Mexican food. The rice burned, the beans boiled over. The woman who ruled empires failed miserably at the most basic task of subsistence, feeling a powerlessness she had never experienced before. Helena watched her with silent patience, correcting her mistakes without humiliation, but with firmness. "Here, Isabel. The only thing that matters is your will to do it. Your diploma of CEO don't clean this stove." The lesson was brutal, but honest. That night, Isabella collapsed on the small, single bed in her cramped room. Her body ached, but her soul ached more. She considered giving up, catching the first flight back to Los Angeles, to the comfort of her family's misery. But the thought of Amalia and of Tomas's gaze stopped her. She remembered the suppressed laughter in the ballroom, the disdain in her own voice, and the dignified face of the woman she had humiliated. Physical pain was the price of her penance, the only thing that kept her grounded in reality. Scrubbing the floor, washing the dirty dishes, and serving the table was the purification she needed. Each task was a step down on the pedestal of her arrogance, and a step up on the ladder of humanity. The irony was palpable. The woman who had sent Amalia stay behind the scenes. She was now herself behind the scenes of life, learning the true art of service and the beauty of anonymous, honest work. Luxury was a mask. Work was a mirror. The chapter ends with Isabella, exhausted, holding Helena's wrinkled hands, apologizing for burning dinner. Helena just smiles. "You are learning 100, and that is more important than any meal." The shock had passed. The learning journey was just beginning. The second week brought a more bearable pace of pain, and Isabella began to find a strange satisfaction in manual labor. The shine of clean dishes and the smell of a fresh house were small rewards, more honest than any applause. While cleaning Helena's office, a modest room but full of life and social project documents, Isabella stumbled upon a stack of photos, and there she was, in various poses, in various projects, Mrs. Amalia Torres. The universe had placed her exactly where she needed to be. The NGO Puente de Luz wasn't just a project. It was Amalia's work, the philanthropic arm of her empire, the place where she invested her soul and her money. Isabella's heart began to pound, a mixture of fear, shame, and overwhelming curiosity. She was cleansing the sanctuary of the woman she had attacked, serving the cause Amalia funded. The coincidence was overwhelming and the lesson undeniable. Helena entered the room and, without understanding Isabella's desperation, began to talk about the NGO and its founder. Doña Amalia is light amidst the arrogance of this world. She is the noblest woman I have ever met, a true root of Mexico. She taught us that humility is what keeps us standing. Isabella, standing with the bucket of dirty water in her hand, nearly dropped it. Helena's sincere praise of Amalia's kindness rang louder than the noise of any newspaper headline. The woman she saw as an enemy was, in fact, a silent mentor. She heard Amalia's story with new ears, no longer as a successful rival, but as the architect of a purposeful life. The former CEO noticed that Helena and the volunteers spoke of Amalia with a love and respect that she, in her prime, had never inspired. The shame of her humiliation gave way to admiration. The punishment wasn't manual labor. The punishment was being so close to true greatness and realizing how far she was from possessing it. The dusty cleaning room was a portal to the truth. Isabella felt the urge to confess, to shout to Helena, "It was me! I'm the woman in the video!" But fear and respect for Amalia's dignity held her back. She knew she had to earn the right to speak, and that words would be empty without actions. Amalia's invisible presence on the NGO's walls and in its projects became her guide, the moral compass Isabella had lost. She worked harder, with more dedication, no longer out of fear of failure, but out of respect for the mission. The chapter ends with Isabella kneeling, not in submission, but in labor. As she scrubbed the office floor, she whispered Amalia's name. The silence, once a burden, was now a promise that the voice of redemption would speak louder than the scream of arrogance. The day began like any other with the smell of coffee and the cleaning routine. Isabella was focused, immersed in the task of vacuuming the living room, when the door opened with a soft noise. The air in the room seemed to condense, and the sound of the vacuum cleaner became a distant roar. There she was, Mrs. Amalia Torres. Not in a ball gown, but in simple, comfortable clothes, with the same unshakable dignity that Isabella had scorned months before. Amalia was visiting the NGO as a surprise, and her eyes, previously filled with sadness, swept the room and fixed on Isabella's figure in a blue uniform. Time froze. The woman she had humiliated was kneeling, her hands covered in dust and sweat. The confrontation involved no shouting or tears, only the stunned silence that preceded a great revelation. Helena, not understanding the tension, introduced the new assistant. "Doña Amalia, this is Isabel, our new and dedicated assistant." Amalia stared at Isabella for a long, torturous minute. There was no rancor in her gaze, but a deep assessment, as if she were weighing the soul of the woman before her. It was a look that saw through disguise, straight to shame. Isabella's breath hitched. She wanted to beg for forgiveness, but her throat was dry. She knew her words no longer carried weight. Forgiveness, if it came, would need to be earned through this silent humiliation. Finally, Amalia spoke, her voice low, but carrying a quiet authority that was more intimidating than any shout. "Isabel, I don't want your apologies. I've heard them many times from people who didn't feel them. I want to see what you do with shame." Amalia's words were Isabella's verdict and challenge. It was an invitation to go beyond the empty words of the elite and delve into the depths of transformative acts. Silence was the most eloquent response. Helena, confused, tried to mediate, but Amalia stopped her with a gesture. The conversation between the two women was a dialogue of souls, an exchange that transcended the status and recent history. The woman in Los Angeles was on her knees. The woman in Mexico City was standing. The chapter ends with Amalia turning around and beginning to discuss the NGO's projects with Helena as if nothing had happened. Isabella, still kneeling, felt a strange relief. The humiliation was over. The ordeal had begun. Redemption would be made of actions. Amalia and Isabella's conversation took place later, behind closed doors in Helena's office, a meeting without cameras or witnesses, where the only currency of exchange was honesty. Amalia was direct, with the clarity of someone who has spent her life separating the essential from the superfluous. "Do you want redemption, Isabel? You don't seek redemption to save your career. You seek it to save the soul. And I'm not the judge, I'm just the bridge. The condition was clear and brutal. Isabella had to join a re-education project on empathy and dignity that Amalia was financing in Ecatepec de Morelos, a poor community on the outskirts of Mexico City. The work should be anonymous, without recognition, without a stage, without the possibility of using the experience for a documentary or a return to the media. You will serve for the sake of serving, Amalia insisted. Your only audience will be the people you help. The world doesn't need your fame. It needs your usefulness. Isabella, who had always lived for the spotlight, felt the blow. It was the final renunciation of her former self, the acceptance of a path of hard work and anonymity that would give her nothing but inner peace. The fear of failure gave way to the need for purpose. Helena, who finally understood who Isabel was, hesitated, worried about the exposure and cruelty of the demand. But Amalia calmed her. She humiliated us. Now she will learn to stand up. It's the only cure for arrogance. Isabella surprised everyone by accepting without question, with a newfound calm that came from accepting her penance. I'd rather carry buckets of dirty water than keep it empty. My luxury has imprisoned me. Humility can free me. Amalia watched her closely. Shame is your harshest teacher. Use it. Turn it into action. If you fail, you don't fail me, you fail yourself. And so the challenge was thrown down, the next phase of the journey. The re-education project involved teaching basic entrepreneurship skills to women who worked as day laborers and artisans. The irony was not lost on Isabella. She, the great CEO broke, would teach business to the women she had scorned. The chapter ends with Isabella leaving Helena's house and heading for the bus that would take her to Ecatepec de Morelos. She was on her way to the life she never imagined, but which now seemed the only life possible. Ecatepec de Morelos was the polar opposite of Los Angeles. Dust, street life, and resilience visible on every woman's face. The community center was simple, but full of energy and hope. Isabella, with the mask of her former life still fading, began to teach basic marketing for small businesses. She tried to start with graphs and technical terms, but the women looked at her with confusion and weariness. One of the students, Rosalia, a maid with strong hands and a golden smile, interrupted her gently. Lady Isabel, we don't need branding. We need to know how to feed our children and how our crafts can give us dignity. The class turned into a learning session for Isabella. She had to deconstruct all her knowledge, strip away her arrogance, CEO, and translate success into livelihood, community, and purpose. The former teacher became the student. Rosalia, when talking about her work, said a phrase that struck Isabella with the force of lightning. Poverty is not humiliation, it is resistance. It's the strength of those who get up every day to fight with their own hands. Isabella blinked, trying to hold back her tears. The women told their stories of sacrifice, of crossing borders, and of building lives from the rubble. They didn't speak of millions, but of pennies that multiplied into hope. They were the source that Amalia spoke of, and Isabella had ignored them. Isabella cried for the first time without self-pity, not for herself, but for the beauty of the strength she saw in those women. The crying was Avanthonist, the cleansing of a soul that had carried the weight of toxic vanity. She changed the class. She started listening. She helped them organize a simple sales plan for a local market, using her knowledge of design to improve the packaging of their handmade products, and taught them to value their time and work. Respect began to emerge, not for his former status, but for her dedication. The women invited her to lunch at their homes, sharing the simple but affectionate meal, which was a balm for her empty soul. The chapter ends with Isabella helping Rosalia carry boxes of products. She was no longer the unattainable executive, but a useful servant. Invisible bridge between her and the people she despised was finally being built. True to his word, Tomas Vega showed up in Ecatepec de Morelos discreetly with his minimal crew. He didn't film the classes, but rather Isabella's behind-the-scenes scenes, sweeping streets and cooking in shelters. The documentary Invisible Bridges was not about Isabella's fall, but about her reconstruction. Scenes of Isabella cleaning a stove were interspersed with the voice-off by Amalia, talking about the true meaning of dignity and work. Tomas didn't try to embellish the story. He showed the pain, the difficulty, and the honesty of the effort. The documentary captured the moment Isabella cried at Rosalia's words, the former CEO embracing the housekeeper, the humility of body and soul. The video went viral, but this time the reaction was different. There was no hate, but a torrent of emotional comments. She is paying with dignity. Work cures arrogance. She is proof that humility is not weakness. Isabella's new fame was not the empty fame of glamour, but the recognition of her restored humanity. People did not applaud her. They understood. The world saw her not as a celebrity, but as a soul in search of peace. Isabella, despite her reluctance to be exposed, allowed the documentary as part of her contract with Tomas, but refused to see the footage. She knew her judgment mattered more than the audience's. True redemption was internal. The feedback, most important, came from Rosalia and the women of Ecatepec. "You are one of us, Isabel," they said. "You are not here to teach us. You are here to learn, and that gives us dignity." Status had been exchanged for belonging. The chapter ends with Isabella sitting on the sidewalk, listening to the women's stories. She was no longer the woman who shines too bright, but an imperfect, yet human woman. The weight of silence was transformed into the power of the collective voice, and her new story was being written. Amalia, fulfilling her silent promise, called Isabella. The invitation was to speak at a social reconciliation in Los Angeles, at the same Beverly Grand Hotel that had been the scene of his humiliation. Isabella felt the icy fear of stepping back onto the ground of her failure. Glamour of Los Angeles intimidated her more than the poverty of Ecatepec. She feared that the public would see her transformation as a coup marketing. But Amalia encouraged her. "You won't speak to them. You will speak to yourself. Humility is not your punishment. It is your strength. Tell the truth. The stage doesn't matter. Your voice does." Isabella took the stage. She wasn't wearing a designer dress, but simple clothes, and her hands were slightly rough. Her hair wasn't perfect, but her eyes shone with a truth she'd never possessed. With a trembling but firm voice, she began. "I thought humility was weakness. I treated dignity as a detail. Today I understand that humility is what keeps the world standing. It's the only mirror where we can see who we really are." She didn't apologize. She explained herself through her experience. She told the story of Rosalia, of the floor she scrubbed, the rice she burned, and the joy of teaching and learning from the women of Ecatepec. She spoke from the heart. The audience, which had condemned her, now wept. It wasn't pity, but identification with the human journey of fall and rise. The silence that followed her speech wasn't one of judgment, but of acceptance and forgiveness. As she stepped off the stage, Amalia was waiting for her. She said nothing, just hugged her. A mother's embrace, a mentor's embrace, a co-architect of a new life. The act was worth 1,000 words. Forgiveness was implicit in the warmth of that embrace. The chapter ends with Isabella, sitting alone in a corner of the hall, finally feeling at peace. The woman who sought the stage for brilliance now sought the truth. The turnaround was complete. The partnership between Isabella and Amalia was a renaissance. They founded the Roots Institute, with headquarters in Los Angeles and Mexico City, with the mission of teaching ethics, empathy, and social responsibility to leaders and young people. Amalia invested the capital, and Isabella put her experience to work. CEO, but this time with the soul of a servant, the Golden Light was reborn, not for profit, but for the purpose of building bridges of dignity between success and humanity. The Races Institute has become a beacon, showing that the glamour and success didn't need to be built on the backs of the humble. Isabella's mission was to deconstruct the ego and blind ambition that had destroyed her. At a fundraising dinner, Amalia raised her glass and made a toast. "You didn't ask me for forgiveness with words, Isabel. You asked me with actions, and actions are worth their weight in gold. You are proof that the root of humanity is stronger than the tallest tower of vanity." The Institute became Isabella's legacy, living proof that failure can be a feedback brutal of the universe. She used her story as a warning, a testament that power is only real when it lifts, not when it humiliates. Isabella traveled constantly between the two cities, between the glamour of the Los Angeles donors and the simplicity of the Mexican communities, and found peace in the duality of his new life. She was the bridge Amalia had taught him to build. True wealth, she realized, lay not in bank accounts, but in the bonds of affection and respect she had rebuilt with people. She had traded an empty empire for a legacy with a soul. The chapter closes with Isabella, Amalia, and Rosalia smiling together at an institute meeting in Mexico. The three women from different worlds were united by a purpose: to use the pain of the past to illuminate the future. The first anniversary of the Races Institute was being celebrated in the same gala ballroom at the Beverly Grand Hotel. Isabella, now the hostess, circulated among the guests, not as the CEO vein, but as the humble visionary. She was serving coffee to the guests, a symbolic act of her new life, when a young woman, a budding journalist and curious, approached. "Excuse me, Lady Duran. Are you the woman in the video that went viral 2 years ago?" Isabella smiled, a genuine smile, without the artificiality of the past. Her eyes shone with the peace of someone who has accepted their own imperfection. She looked at her hands, no longer soft, and answered with the clarity of her truth. "Yes, I am that woman. And that mistake was the best start of my life." She didn't shy away. She embraced shame as part of her story, the mark of her redemption. The journalist, surprised by the honesty, thanked him and walked away. Isabella continued serving coffee, feeling the fullness of being in the present, without hiding from the past. She had transformed the weight of silence from ostracism in the power of his transformed voice. The camera slowly pans up, revealing the room that was once a scene of humiliation, now a symbol of reconstruction, filled with leaders and young people learning about empathy. Amalia and Isabella look at each other from afar, their partnership sealed by respect. True power, Isabella had learned, was not in humiliating, but in lifting up those you once ignored. Luxury was an illusion. Dignity was the only non-negotiable currency. Isabella's story wasn't about financial success, but about the courage to break the mirror of vanity and face the true essence of humanity. The silence she had imposed on the servant was the lesson the universe had imposed upon her. If the story of Isabella and Amalia touched you and made you reflect on the weight of humility and ambition, subscribe to the channel. Activate the bell so you don't miss our next story of transformation and redemption. Remember Isabella's final message. True power is not in humiliating, it is in lifting up those you once ignored. The fall is not the end, it's just the beginning of your bridge to truth. Use your past to build your purpose.